Welcome to this special Best of ECTRIMS short video. I'm John Strum, and just a few weeks ago, I was in Copenhagen, Denmark, attending ECTRIMS, the largest MS research conference in the world. One of the more interesting presentations at ECTRIMS was Dr. Jiwon Oh's presentation of the data from the Phase 3 clinical trial for an investigational disease-modifying therapy called Tolebrutinib. In this trial, Tolebrutinib was analyzed to determine its efficacy among people with relapsing remitting MS. And while this clinical trial failed to reach its primary endpoint, it did meet its secondary endpoint, presenting what I'll call an interesting situation. I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Gwan Oh, the principal investigator in that Phase 3 clinical trial. In a moment, you'll hear our conversation, and you'll hear Dr. O explain why the outcome of this clinical trial still demonstrates a major benefit for people with relapsing remitting MS. Then you'll see my conversation with Cliff, someone who lives with MS, and you'll see and hear Cliff's reaction to the news that Dr. O presented at ECTRIMS. This video presentation was made possible through a generous grant from Sanofi. Dr. Jiwon Oh is a neurologist, scientist, and the medical director of the Barlow Multiple Sclerosis Program at St. Michael's Hospital in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Oh is also the principal investigator in Gemini, the Phase 3 clinical trial for Tolebrutinib, and she's at ECTRIMS to share the outcome of that clinical trial. Dr. Oh, can you explain what Tolebrutinib is?
Sure. Probably many people in the field have heard about drugs like Tolebrutinib in the last few years because there's been many different drugs like Tolebrutinib that fall into this category of drug called the BTK inhibitors or Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors. And what these drugs are, they're oral pills that basically it's an enzyme that we think decreases the effect of B cells, but many of them can actually get into the brain, and they probably have a beneficial effect on decreasing B cells as well as maybe microglia within the brain. And so there's a lot of excitement in the field about BTK inhibitors like Tolebrutinib because we know that in the periphery, B cells play a major role in MS pathophysiology. And then within the brain, we know that CNS resident B cells and microglia, the bad kind of microglia, play a dominant role in mediating progressive disease biology. So that's why there's so much excitement in the field about this class of molecule, and Tolebrutinib happens to be one of the BTK inhibitors.
And what was a Gemini clinical trial designed to evaluate?
So this was actually two nearly identical trials that looked at people with relapsing MS. And like a typical contemporary relapsing MS clinical trial, included people who had evidence of relapsing disease activity, either clinical relapses or new MRI lesions in the year or two to enrollment. And it was comparing the effect of Tolebrutinib versus one of our oral platform therapies, teriflunomide. And the primary endpoint of interest was annualized relapse rate, which is typically the case for most relapsing MS Phase 3 clinical trials. And then the secondary endpoints of interest included confirmed disability worsening, confirmed disability improvement, as well as the usual MRI measures that we look at.
What did you learn in this Phase 3 clinical trial?
Disappointingly, Tolebrutinib for the primary endpoint of interest, annualized relapse rate, did not show a difference compared to teriflunomide. But it's not to say that it's not effective against relapse disease biology. It's just that it wasn't superior to teriflunomide, which is a commonly used platform disease-modifying agent. But what was interesting, though, is when you look at the secondary endpoints, despite the fact that there was no difference in Tolebrutinib and teriflunomide with respect to its ability to reduce relapses, there was a clear difference in Tolebrutinib's ability to decrease disability worsening in comparison to teriflunomide. So this is really interesting. So the primary endpoint wasn't met, so technically the trial was negative. However, when you look at some of these secondary endpoints, the fact that there was no differences in relapses, but that there was a difference in the likelihood of disability progressing and that Tolebrutinib was able to prevent this and the relative reduction was approximately 30%, that's really interesting because it tells us that Tolebrutinib may not be different compared to teriflunomide with respect to relapse disease biology, but that other component I told you about getting into the brain and maybe targeting some of the cells and pathways that are involved in progressive disease biology, this is precisely where it may have a benefit over teriflunomide.
That's what I was wondering as you were explaining that perhaps the mechanism of action is different and it's perhaps not built to necessarily have an impact on the primary endpoint. But at the same time, as you point out, this secondary endpoint is interesting.
It's really interesting, and particularly when you take into account the fact that Dr. Bob Fox presented the results of Hercules, which was tolebrutinib's effect in non-relapsing secondary progressive MS, and very clearly versus placebo, tolebrutinib met its primary endpoint, which was disability worsening in that trial. The totality of evidence here really seems to suggest that tolebrutinib has a beneficial effect on progressive disease biology.
That's something you don't get to say very often.
No, actually, almost never. And so it's really exciting and a really important moment in the field because Hercules was actually the first clinical trial that was designed to look at non-relapsing secondary progressive MS. And the fact that there is this agent that clearly met the endpoint there, but also in the relapsing MS clinical trial, again, there was no difference in reducing relapses versus teriflunomide, but that there was a clear difference in disability worsening. That's profound and great news for people living with MS because it's probably the first time we're seeing a drug that very clearly has an effect on non-relapsing disease biology.
So now that you have this data, what happens next?
A lot of things. I think obviously the database was just unlocked less than 3 weeks ago, so many more analyses need to be done. But the company needs to file for regulatory approval, given the positive results in Hercules. And it'll be interesting to see how this drug is approved, just because in the field, and obviously regulatory rules are very complicated and above my pay grade. However, it's interesting because we are understanding in the field that progression happens across the entire spectrum of MS, regardless of whether you have, quote, relapsing disease or progressive disease. And theoretically, this is probably an agent that is useful for many people with MS, even those without non-relapsing SPMS. But how that will translate into regulatory approval, I'm not really sure. So it will be interesting to see.
It will, and definitely above my pay grade completely. Dr. Jiwon Oh, I want to thank you for all you do, both in the lab and in the clinic, to improve the lives of people with MS. Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thank you for having me, John. It's always a pleasure.
This conversation has been made possible through a generous grant from Sanofi.
Just watched my conversation at ECTRIMS with Dr. Jiwon Oh, and joining me to provide some perspective from someone who's living with MS is Cliff. Thanks for joining me today, Cliff.
Thank you for having me, John. Really appreciate being here.
Can you tell me when you were diagnosed with MS?
Sure. I was diagnosed in 2018, but it took about 10 years for me to get a diagnosis.
Oh, really?
Quite a journey. Come to find out that that's not entirely unusual, sadly. And but you just have to be your own advocate, and luckily I learned from some other experiences with my wife's cancer that you just can't take no for an answer and have to keep going back.
Sometimes that's all you can do is be persistent. But I'm glad you were, obviously, and now getting the care and treatment that you need. So good things.
Thank you.
We just heard Dr. O discussing the Gemini clinical trial, which focused on a potential disease-modifying therapy called tolebrutinib and relapsing remitting MS. Now, tolebrutinib is part of a new category of DMTs called BTK inhibitors. Had you heard anything about tolebrutinib or BTK inhibitors?
So, great question, John. Yes, I've been following the BTK stuff for the better part of 4 or 5 years. I think you had mentioned it really early on, and probably like 2018 on RealTalk, probably episode 121 or something. Who's counting? I've heard them all multiple times. I love the I love the podcast. Anyway, what was really cool is it always showed like there was some kind of progression happening with the research in BTK, and it was a totally different approach. So I followed it closely, and in fact, I took an immunology class from Rice University on innate and active immune system responses to things. And it seemed like everybody is like, well, if we could just kind of tweak the engine to focus on the innate side of things, maybe that'll work. And here we are. It's really exciting.
Well, for some of our viewers who perhaps haven't been following along with the podcast as diligently as you have, I'll quickly sum up that BTK inhibitors block the activity of a protein that helps B cells to develop. It's already used to treat various cancers that are caused by defective B cells. And now, other disease-modifying therapies have also been shown to be effective in managing MS by targeting and destroying B cells. But these DMTs can't penetrate the blood-brain barrier. Tolebrutinib has been shown to penetrate the blood-brain barrier and enter the central nervous system. That's a first for an MS disease-modifying therapy. What are your thoughts about that?
It's very promising. And I think, the idea that we could go from having to do an injection or an infusion to a pill format that shows a lot more promise in limiting disability and also limiting relapses if we get to that point. That's awesome. I think when I talk to a lot of people that have MS, they really struggled with the idea of doing an injection or doing an infusion. And there are pill things out there right now, but those are more MABs. They're not the nib type class drugs. And um, if we can convince people to just take a drug, maybe it'll actually lower the cost of the drug as well. I don't know. So it's super exciting. The delivery method could be a game changer in itself.
Now, this phase 3 clinical trial failed to meet its primary endpoint. It failed to show that tolebrutinib was superior to Aubagio in reducing the annualized relapse rate for people with relapsing MS. But, and here's where it gets interesting, it met its secondary endpoint of 6-month confirmed disability worsening, demonstrating that tolebrutinib significantly delayed the time to onset of disability worsening. Your thoughts, Cliff?
I'm all for that. I'm all for that. And actually, I would like to read a little bit more into the study and see exactly how they measured that. I don't know if they're still using the EDSS um, in the clinical trials or not. Are you aware of that, John?
They pretty much every clinical trial does include the EDSS.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So if that's a situation and that's what we're tracking things with, that's fantastic. A 30% reduction is huge. And the way I apply it to my own existence here is like, what if I had 30% more of my abilities back? Well, if I didn't have as much trouble walking, or if I didn't have as much trouble spasming all night and waking up in the middle of the night, or any number of the symptoms, that's how I kind of compute it in my head, is like 30% is kind of close to 50%. I'm optimistic, right? And that's awesome. So I think it's showing a lot of good forward motion. And I often tell people, um, it sounds so strange. And I get some weird looks. I said, MS is a good disease to have. And they look at me kind of oddly. And I say, it's well researched, it's well funded, and there's a lot of progress happening in it. When you look at other diseases you could get stuck with, kind of lucked out. Like there might be a cure within the next 10 or 20 years. And that's great. And this is showing that direction, different types of thinking, different types of delivery mechanisms, attacking different parts of the disease. So I'm very hopeful, seeing the progress of this. Yeah, we lost one battle with the relapsing remitting, but we gained with the reduction in disability, which is fantastic.
So, when a drug fails to meet its primary endpoint, it can be less likely that it's going to be approved by the FDA. Yet in this case, as we've been discussing, there was a notable benefit demonstrated. So when it comes to the decision to approve tolebrutinib for treating relapsing remitting MS, I think I know your answer. What do you think the FDA should do?
I'm on board with it as long as we can really get the safety profile well communicated to the end user, which is me, right? I don't want to find out 3 years from now it's going to make my legs fall off. So if if the safety profile is under control, and that's really the only risk, right? And if we can figure out that it's a safe drug to take, then I think it's a really neat option for us with MS, with relapsing remitting.
Well, you bring up an important point when you bring up the safety profile. And of course, you don't have to worry about your legs falling off. However, there was shown to be an increased risk of liver damage. And the way they found to offset that was close monitoring over the first 90 days of taking Tolebrutinib. So if taking Tolebrutinib brought you the upside, the benefit that we've been discussing in terms of delaying disability worsening, but required you to be monitored, say, on a weekly basis for the first 90 days, is that a fair trade-off to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and with some of the other drugs like Kesimpta and I think Ocrevus in some regards, I think those also have the same liver concerns. I think that's what I've seen. I've taken both of those. I mean, yeah, I'm looking at the long-term effect of the drug over the short-term possible risks. Livers are pretty durable. I think, if I had to find another one, there might be one out there, but I don't want to be in a wheelchair in 5 years, basically.
I think just to clarify, you wouldn't have to worry about going out to find a new liver, I don't believe, because this monitoring would be required. So what that might mean is you would have to show up at the clinic on a weekly basis for the first 3 months of taking the medication. Some people would find that fairly intrusive into their regular lives, into their normal day-to-day, week-to-week schedule. Is that something that you feel is still is the juice worth the squeeze, I guess?
Definitely. My MS is at a point right now where it's bad enough to be okay if it's slightly inconvenient to my schedule. I mean, I spend most of my day managing my disease. It's gone from being a slight annoyance to basically I've had to completely change my lifestyle, which has affected my family. So, there's I have to look at the bigger picture here. And if I have to go out of my way to get a blood test once a week, I think that's a big payoff to know I'm going to be able to be mobile and there for my family in a number of years when the MS could possibly be even more progressed without a drug like this.
Well, we're going to be keeping a close watch on what happens as Tolebrutinib makes its way through the regulatory process. Cliff, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with me today.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Love the podcast. Been listening for years, and it is my source, my go-to source for the information because there's nothing made up. It's fantastic. So kudos.
Thanks very much. That could be a new tagline. There's nothing made up. You're absolutely right about that. Thanks, Cliff. Take care.
Thanks, John. Have a good one.